Hey everyone, welcome back to Add to Your Faith Ministry, Synoptic Gospel Study. I'm Elizabeth Lanu Bardhan, and today we are doing the story of the feeding of the 4,000. Now we're going to be reading both in Matthew and in Mark. It is pretty short, so let's look at Matthew chapter 15, verses 32 to 39. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, Where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, How many loaves do you have? They said, 7, and a few small fish, and directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. All right, let's read Mark chapter 8, verses 1 to 9. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the direction of Dalmanutha, which is Magadan again, a different name for it. Okay, so first of all, this is not the same event as the feeding of the 5,000 men plus women and children that we studied earlier. This is the feeding of 4,000 people. Now, it's interesting that this specifically says 4,000 people. It does not say men with an implied not counted women and children. This one just says 4,000 people. So the assumption is this was both men and women, since it says people, not men, when the 5,000 were specifically called men. So we're going to go with this is actually 4,000 people. Now, in the passage right before this, in Matthew, it talks about all these people coming to the mountains where Jesus was and bringing all the sick with them, and he healed them, and the people marveled. Last week we talked about the healing of the mute man, who most likely was a part of that group. And I think it's significant that they have been with Jesus for 3 days and nobody has eaten. And after 3 days, Jesus is like, okay, I'm worried about everybody. I have compassion on them, as he said. Like, I am feeling the fact that these people are hungry, and if I send them away at this point, they could faint on their way home, because some people have come a really long way. I love that, Jesus is always aware of our needs. He is not blind to our physical issues that can come from spiritual service. As we serve the Lord and experience God the way these people were. I mean, they didn't want to leave. For 3 days, they've been watching Jesus heal and most likely preach. And during this time, they're just experiencing God and are not concerned about the fact that they don't have food, but Jesus gets concerned for them. Sometimes we can be, I don't know if this is the right application, but we can be a little hyper spiritual where, people can fast too much or hurt their bodies in some way or minister too much, not take enough rest. Pastors especially can get into that habit of overworking in the name of ministry and hurting themselves. And I think Jesus has compassion and seeing how much someone is doing and what their needs are, and then wanting to provide for those needs because he understands. And that's what we see. So Jesus is like, we need to feed them. And the disciples, being very practical people, despite having watched Jesus do healings for 3 days, they know he just fed 5,000 people not too long ago, and they're just like, where are we supposed to get bread out here in this desolate place? It was a desolate place the last time when Jesus fed 5,000 men, plus women and children. But yet the disciples' response is, I don't know how you expect us to do this. I think oftentimes when God asks us to do something, our response can very blindly be, well, that's not possible. How am I supposed to do that? The disciples were looking at it from what they could do and the impossibility instead of saying what Jesus could do. And despite having been with him, despite seeing him constantly heal and do feeding miracles, still yet they tried to respond. When Jesus said, feed them, they automatically said, okay, how do we possibly do that? With frustration and a little bit overwhelmed sounding. And I think we do that so much where God tells us to do something, we immediately try and are frustrated and overwhelmed because we can't do that. We're not able. Jesus is the one who's supposed to be doing it. But instead of running right to him and saying, okay, Jesus, what do you want me to bring you or do so that you can do this miracle? Instead, it's, what am I supposed to do? I can't do this. And that emotional response is revealing that we are depending on ourselves rather than on Christ. Is what happened to the disciples in this situation. So what does Jesus do? He walks them through it and says, okay, first of all, how many loaves of bread do we have? And they had 7. Now, if you remember in the feeding of the 5,000, there were 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But in this story, there's 7 loaves and a few small fish. They don't say how many fish exactly. And so Jesus did the same as he did in the 5,000. He broke the bread and fish. It was handed out to everybody. Everybody ate plenty. And then what they picked up was 7 baskets full. Now, in the feeding of the 5,000, there were 12 baskets left over. So this one is 7 baskets. Now, in the feeding of the 5,000 and the 12 baskets, we always compare that to the 12 disciples. Each one had a basket that they could pick up. The abundance over what Jesus had done, was correlated to the number of disciples. Even though there was less bread, there was only 5 loaves, it got more back. And this one with the 7 loaves, less people and less back. It's interesting, how the miracles are specifically different based on the situation. And 7 in Scripture is the number of completion. It can also be the number of God. I don't think numbers always matter. Sometimes they do. I don't really know if this 7 is specifically about God's perfection, his perfect work, his doing the completion of the work, and it not being the work of man, but the work of God, it being exactly complete to what God needed it to be. But at any rate, there are 7 loaves and 7 baskets. And I think just in general, what this teaches us is how God can take something very small to meet our needs and meet them in abundance, more than we need, and in a complete and perfect way, as the number 7 says. So, whatever in your life you are needing God's provision, or you're needing God's answer, or God's asking you to do something, and it's impossible for you to do, then look at what Jesus can do and ask him what your part is. The disciples' part was to find the bread and give it to Jesus, not to actually feed the people. They didn't have to do the miracle. They just were supposed to find the bread. And at first they thought he meant find bread enough to feed everybody, and that's not what Jesus meant. He knew that was impossible. What he meant was, give me what you do have and I will multiply it. And that's what we need to do. We need to give Jesus what we do have and let him multiply it, rather than trying to complete everything ourselves or being overwhelmed because we know we don't have enough. We personally aren't able to do enough to fix the problem, but Jesus does have enough to fix the problem. And so just coming to him and saying, here I am, whatever part you want me to play in this process, I'm here, but I know that you're the one who has to actually do it. And that removes that emotional burden from us to try to complete something on our own, and instead transfers that to Christ to let him complete it perfectly with whatever he's told us to give him. And that's a really important thing, I think, for us to realize. And also the fact that these people have been experiencing God for 3 days. They've been watching him heal. Some of them are the ones that have been healed, and they're with him, and they're hungry, and they're not concerned about it. They just want to experience God, and he is having compassion for them. And then verse 37, and they all ate and were satisfied. Jesus, when he provides for us, he provides for our needs and he provides to satisfaction. It will be enough. And then there's abundance, more than what we need. And that abundance was taken back. And I think like many times in our lives, God gives us enough for what we need to be satisfied. And then he wants us to let the rest, the abundance, be taken up in baskets. They don't say what they used those baskets for or how it was, what happened to those 7 baskets or before to the 12 baskets from the first time. But what I see is that abundance being given back to God. In your life, when Jesus is doing a miracle in your life in some way, he's providing for your family's needs, he's using you in some form of ministry, he's allowing you to share the gospel or to do church work or to do your secular job in a way that honors God, to work in your community in a way that's bringing God glory, etc. When you're in that position and you know that it's not you, that it's God working through you, and instead of taking that burden on yourself, you are releasing yourself to God for God to guide you on what he's going to ask you to do and what he's going to do while you're working with him. And then you will be satisfied. Your needs will be met. But then there's going to be an abundance that's supposed to go back to God. And that's not just like a tithe, though a tithe is a good example of an abundance of our money. Not even our abundance, out of everything, the percentage going. But what I'm talking about is that spiritual abundance. As we read the Bible, as we pray, as we study, as we learn, we can have a spiritual abundance, meaning the filling of the Holy Spirit fully in our life, meeting all of our needs, protecting us from our sinful nature, guiding us into the right direction we should go, giving us his wisdom, his fruits of his Spirit and stuff. That has a more than we need, more than is satisfied, and out of that abundance is what we can use to minister to others. What happens a lot of times in the Christian life, I think, is people try to minister not out of their abundance, but out of their need. So instead of being met first with God and being satisfied, they try to just give out of their emptiness. And when you're spiritually depleted and emotionally depleted, physically hungry, in this story, then you're going to faint. And that's what Jesus said. He's like, I don't want them to go without being filled because they'll faint. And we do this fainting in ministry, where people just get exhausted. They might give up from ministry. They might give up from their Christian walk. They just can't do it. And they can't. They're fainting. This is a real reaction to no spiritual energy, no spiritual food. And so Jesus doesn't want that for us. Instead, he wants to satisfy that need in us so that we don't faint as we go on our way. The Christian walk, going on our way and not fainting, comes from being fed by Christ. Now, sometimes some of that food comes from church, and our worship experience and our listening to preaching and the fellowship. We're getting that filling of abundant spiritual life that allows us to minister to each other and encourage each other, edify each other out of that abundance. Whereas sometimes that kind of starts it for the week, but then you definitely need to have daily time with God, daily family, worship, Bible reading, personal journaling, whatever process that God uses in your life for a daily experience with him, so that you continue to be satisfied and have abundance of spiritual satisfaction that he can then bring back as a gift to God to use to your neighbors and to your family and to your church and your community and to the world. It is, I think, a really important principle that these people, they stayed with Christ and they were experiencing him, but then when Christ went to meet their needs, they ate and were satisfied. Don't let something keep you from eating and being satisfied. When God brings you spiritual food, experience God. Eat that. Be filled and have that abundance to give back to him. When we try to do it on our own, when we are distracted by the world, by our troubles, by our own just emotions, whatever, then we're missing out on God feeding us. God sees our needs. He knows what they are. He will provide, just as Christ does in this passage, and we can be satisfied, but it's a matter of how we interact with him in this process. There could have been people there that day that would not have been satisfied if they just hadn't eaten. They're like, oh no, there's not enough. Somebody, you all go eat first, and then I'll eat some. Of course, there was abundance. It might have worked, but the principle there is, I think that happens a lot, especially with Christians who want to serve God, is they're afraid to take for themselves. They just want everybody else to take first. So they're constantly serving, constantly giving, and never actually themselves being filled, being ministered to. So watch out for that. The disciples tried to do it on their own. That was wrong. The people just experienced God without eating, without food. They didn't get a chance to recharge. And then when Jesus took care of that out of his compassion, then they were satisfied and filled, and there was abundance. So I hope that as you consider where you are in this passage, are you the disciples trying to do all the ministry on your own and you have no abundance with which to do ministry or to trust Christ to do it himself? Are you the people who just keep serving God to a point that you're about to faint and you are desperately in need of filling? Where are you? And just bring that to Christ and surrender that to him and realize that he's the one who has the answer. He's the one who does the miracle. We are just a part of the process in whatever way he allows us to, either the one receiving it or bringing him the things that are used to do it. The disciples brought him fish and bread. Sometimes we're the ones who bring the lesson or bring the music or bring the prayer that other people are going to be able to see multiplied in their lives by Christ. But we also have to partake of that blessing. The disciples also had to eat, or they would have been hungry. So it's important, I think, to just see the broadness of this experience and what Christ is teaching us in principle about himself and the way he deals with us, as well as the literal miracle of actually feeding people with the bread and the fish as they did the first time. Now, I will touch on, some people ask, is this the same experience as the 5,000? Like I've already said, it's not. Several differences, but there's several similarities. And the reason there's similarities is it was common for people to pack bread and fish for a luncheon. Like I think if it was in today's world, it'd be like a tuna fish sandwich, bread and fish. We still do that for picnics. So this is just a common thing that people would pack that they could keep with them. It may have been a pickled fish because that preserves better, but whatever it was, this was something that in both stories we see is more common for these fishermen people. This is a fishing community to have with them when they are out and about. We don't know if it was the disciples' luncheon that was packed or if it was someone else. In the first story, it was a child who had brought his lunch, but everybody else didn't. Very well prepared mom there. In this one, the disciples say, we have this, so it could have been someone again gave it to them or it was theirs. But at either point, it's what Jesus used for this miracle. Okay, if you have any questions or thoughts or ideas you'd like to share, please comment on the video, or you can always send me a message. I look forward to hearing from you and hope it was a blessing. Bye-bye.